Hello everyone, in this review video I'm going to use several of the models and concepts that we developed in our AP Microeconomics course to tell a sophisticated story about pandemic economics. And so the first model that we are going to use to tell this story is externalities. But before we get into this, some vocabulary terms that we need to review over here are market failure and of course externality. So an externality is a type of market failure, and a market failure is a situation where the market doesn't maximize social welfare. And what is social welfare? Well, we've talked a lot about how we measure social welfare in economics. A lot of the times there are other ways to measure social welfare, even in economics. But we use this idea of social surplus, which is the sum of consumer and producer surplus. And what are those, right? Well, here's sort of an example. I would have been willing to pay $15 for this cup of coffee because I'm tired as heck. But I got this cup of coffee from the teacher's lounge for 25 cents. And so my consumer surplus reflects the net benefit measured in dollars that I receive from consumption, right? And so what we would do is we would take the $15, my willingness to pay, minus the actual price of the cup of coffee, which is 25 cents, and that would be my consumer surplus, which would be $14.75. Producer surplus, insofar as the price set in the market is greater than the marginal cost of producing, would be the price minus the marginal cost of production, right? And so we can graphically think about consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is everything beneath the demand curve and above the price, and producer surplus is everything above the supply curve and below the price. And so we say that private markets, absent a market failure, assuming perfect competition, do this wonderful thing where they maximize social surplus in society, right? The logic behind this would be that both consumers and producers, if left alone, are going to do all the things that are going to they're going to undertake activities where their benefits exceed their costs and not undertake activities where their costs exceed their benefits, therefore maximizing social surplus. Well, externalities and markets can fail. An externality is one type of market failure where social surplus is not maximized. And the reason why social surplus or social welfare is not maximized in the case of externalities is because the parties engaged in a market transaction in the case of externalities do not internalize all of the costs or benefits associated with that market transaction. There are costs or benefits that are externalized on third parties that didn't consent to that market transaction. And so we can actually tell a story about the pandemic using externalities, right? And so here are the graphical representation of externalities. And so the way that we can think of this, right, is that in a normal market, the private marginal benefit curve and the social marginal benefit curve is equal to the demand curve. It's the same thing. And the supply curve is equal to the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve. Remember, we said producer theory, up your marginal cost increases, and so that's why you have an upward sloping supply curve, right? Well, with externalities, the way that we can conceptualize this externalization of cost or benefits is by either showing a gap between the private marginal benefit curve and the social marginal benefit curve in consumption externalities, or in production externalities, showing a gap between the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve, right? And so here is a externality that shows vaccine consumption, right? A positive consumption externality. And we can actually see, or before I get into that, we can see that there's a gap between the private marginal benefit curve, which is further to the left than the social marginal benefit curve. And we can actually see this red triangle area represents diff rate loss. Those are transactions that don't take place, if this market failure didn't take place, or that would be socially welfare maximizing if they took place, but they don't take place. Leaving this market alone, you get dead weight loss. And we can think about why a private marginal benefit curve may be further to the left than the social marginal benefit curve. And we all kind of intuitively know this, right? There are people that are hesitant about getting the vaccine. I don't mean to be demeaning with this photo. I'm just kind of using this as a pedagogical tool. I'm sure that people have an array of reasons of why they are hesitant to get the vaccine, although I think that they are not, based in, rigorous scientific weighing of costs and benefits, more so sort of sociological explanations of why people may be vaccine hesitant. Maybe watching too much I Am Legend, or thinking that there are computer chips in the vaccine, or the government's like that stuff. Or maybe being fearful of the side effects, stuff like that. For whatever reason, the private marginal benefit curve is shifted to the left from the social marginal benefit curve. And we see news report after news report, and I'm going to put a link in the description of this YouTube video showing that Americans are very hesitant to get the vaccine. Right? There is supply is no longer an issue in the United States. It was in the early months of 2021, but now demand is the issue, where there is a significant part of the American population that is very vaccine hesitant. But they don't internalize all the benefits associated with getting a vaccine, right? There are benefits associated with consuming a vaccine, right? You protect yourself and other people, right? Other people, I feel safer knowing my friends are vaccinated, all that sorts of stuff. We can see that gap, right? And we can see that go down to the x-axis, and we can also tell a tale of underconsumption. And so now the question becomes, right, there is room for governments to intervene and to rectify market failures, right, and to essentially close this gap between the private marginal benefit curve and the social marginal benefit curve. And maybe this comes in the form of public information campaigns. Private actors too, Georgetown and an array of other colleges, I have to cite Georgetown, are mandating that people get vaccines before they can return to campus, right, to sort of close this gap. Right, so there's room for policy to help us push us towards a socially welfare maximizing equilibrium. But we can also think of negative consumption externalities, like perhaps indoor dining or going to like bars or restaurants, right? Kind of ensuring that the virus is still in circulation, right? Doing a lot of those unsafe activities that I know a lot of us enjoy and really, really miss. Well, there is an externality associated with it, because you're not the only one that internalizes that cost. Society does as well, right? Because the virus is in circulation, or continues to be in circulation. And so we can conceptualize this as a private marginal benefit and a social marginal benefit gap again, but this time the social marginal benefit curve is further to the left, and the private marginal benefit curve is to the right, and now we can see that we have overconsumption. And then here, we can also think of production externalities, right? And we can think about pharmaceutical research and development, right? And so this is going to lead us to our next topic, right? Incentivizing innovation, or thinking about sort of, array of policies that might incentivize, research and development. But, innovators and inventors and creators, they don't get to internalize all the benefits of their innovation because, it's hard to keep things under wraps for long, assuming that there is no patents or copyrights, right? The benefits are externalized, right? And so we can see that in this example, there's underproduction of research and development. And so we can think about vaccine research and development. And I'm going to put a link in the description of this YouTube video to Operation Warp Speed and sort of the ways in which it tries to shift the private marginal benefit curve to the social, or private marginal cost curve to the social marginal cost curve. Because remember, we're playing with production externalities to incentivize, vaccine manufacturers to sort of, to engage in more risky, or not to engage in more risky behavior, but to it sort of socializes a lot of the costs associated with vaccine production and sort of nudges and accelerates the process. I suppose that's a good way to describe it. Or we could just describe it as closing the gap between the private marginal cost curve and social marginal cost curve. So we can see for society, the cost of vaccine development is lower than the private actors internalize. And we can see that we have underproduction of vaccine research and development, and there's room, again, for government policy in pushing the private marginal cost curve to the social marginal cost curve, and we saw that with Operation Warp Speed in the Trump administration and presumably other governmental policies. Right? Okay. So another way, so let me talk about externalities a bit more. One way that we can bridge these gaps, right, with consumption externalities, we can do stuff like, or negative consumption externalities, we can do stuff like regulation, close buildings down, and this is where it gets into sensitive debates, especially in a society like the United States, where we are heavy on individualistic values and use a lot of individualistic rhetoric in our arguments. But also here we can see a government subsidy pushing the private marginal cost curve towards the social marginal cost curve, or maybe cash payments, right, for the vaccine consumption may be coming soon for the vaccine hesitant. I read a recent report that people that are vaccine hesitant are, half of them would be willing to take the vaccine if they got a $100 check for it. So there might be some checks coming for the vaccine hesitant. But there's other ways that we can incentivize research and development. We can do this by granting firms artificial monopolies, right? And so I want to make a distinction between artificial monopolies or government-opposed monopolies, and just talk generally about how monopolies arise. I want to make a distinction between artificial monopolies and natural monopolies really quickly, and then talk about the logic of government-created monopolies, right? And so natural monopolies, you had a FRQ on your AP Microeconomics mock exam, exist when the average total cost curve, the long-run average total cost curve, is downward sloping over the relevant range of output, right? Meaning downward sloping pretty much all the way across the market demand curve, right? And so this would reflect a situation in which there are huge, enormous fixed costs, right? So utilities are examples of natural monopolies. There are enormous fixed costs for a water utility laying down the pipes, right? Huge fixed costs and very trivial marginal costs. It doesn't take a lot to, increase or hook on another house or deliver water to someone, right? Through pipes, right? The pipes are the enormous fixed costs, and then relatively trivial marginal costs, right? The marginal cost curve is flat, it seems. I kind of drew it like it seems to be rising at some point too. That was intentional to show you that, right? In that sort of, marginal costs might increase after some time, but as long as over the relevant range of output, the LRATC curve is downward sloping, we have a natural monopoly. Why does this create natural monopolies? Well, the first firm that acquires this market, the first firm that lays the pipes down, right, they have a unique ability. If another firm threatens to enter the market, they can just charge at marginal costs until the other firm leaves, right? And so the other firm would be bleeding and hemorrhaging, losing tons of money, and this natural monopoly has and owns the market, right? And so we can think about sort of the profits associated with natural monopolies, right? The same profit maximizing rule holds. Marginal cost and marginal revenue go all the way up to the demand curve and across, that's the price. And then the profit is this shaded area all the way down to the ATC curve, go across, and then the profits are right here. All right, but I don't want to get into natural monopolies too much because that doesn't really help us tell the tale of pandemic economics. But artificial monopolies, right, to potentially incentivize pharmaceutical companies, for instance, to engage in research and development. That's one way in which governments try to incentivize research and development. Here, I'm going to provide you with a patent, right? It's also one way, not just scientific research and development, but musical artists. There's a series of copyright laws that protect creative artists from copyright infringement, right? Because the idea is to incentivize them to continue to produce creative things. Right, so here is the monopoly model. Right, we can grant someone an artificial monopoly. This is not a natural monopoly, right, because we see an ATC curve that is upward sloping eventually over a relevant range of output. And perhaps, right, this would be something like the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine are essentially granted natural monopolies over the vaccine that they developed. Right? Profit maximizing rule is the same, marginal cost and price. Go all the way down to the ATC curve across, we can see all the profits that they get. Now the interesting thing about monopolies, however, is that monopolists have this unique ability to charge what is called a hefty markup, right? Ability to charge a price greater than the marginal cost to produce that good, right? And then there's also this added dimension where we get, and we can think of this right here, right? This red area right here, underproduction, right? We get a market failure with monopolies because we're not able to produce the social welfare maximizing quantity, which would be here at the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the demand curve. This would also be the allocative efficient point. So I'm going to draw this as Q PC, right? Perfectly competitive markets would produce here, right? And they would actually produce at a lower price too. Everyone can see that? Now, what's interesting about well, every time there's a great loss, there's room for government regulation. But we know that because of this research and development externality, right, this gap between the private marginal cost curve and social marginal cost curve, that governments, and the United States government specifically, grants patents to incentivize research and development, right? Essentially grants you the ability to charge monopoly prices if you come up with a really great scientific innovation and tool, right? If a lot of you are going to be business majors, your dream and aspiration should be to run a monopoly, right? Because you have this ability to charge a price greater than the cost to produce it, right? A hefty markup depending on how inelastic the demand curve is. Right, and so let's think about the welfare implications of monopolies before I cut off this video. Let's think about how we can conceptualize sort of the welfare implications associated with monopolies further, right? I introduced the concept of good weight loss, but we can also throw consumer and producer surplus in there. We can see the producer surplus is huge. Consumer surplus, everything beneath the demand curve and above the price is right there. And then we get dead weight loss, right? And so in this case, we're assuming one price. We're assuming that this monopolist can't discriminate against people, right? And so that's why we have a marginal revenue curve that is twice as steep as the demand curve, right? Because there's this poisoning effect, right? If you can only charge one price, then to sell more and more units, you have to lower the price on everyone else, right? And so you get this poisoning effect, right? And so we have some consumer surplus, but we know that monopolists often engage in what is called price discrimination, right? To take up or eat up some of the consumer surplus, right? Eat up some of the consumer surplus, right? The monopolists oftentimes don't engage in just one price, right? They try to eat up some of the consumer surplus, right? And this is an example of a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. A perfectly price discriminating monopolist would charge, people that would be willing to pay a much higher price. They would charge these people right here a lower price than people up further up the demand curve, right? They would charge everybody different prices depending on where they were located along the demand curve. That's a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. And this suggests, right, a situation in which actually we wouldn't get dead weight loss in this situation. We would be social welfare maximizing, but it suggests a limitation of this monopoly, or this concept of consumer and our social surplus as a way of measuring social welfare, right? If we lose all of this surplus or of all this, if this is social welfare maximizing, but it's all producer surplus, is this really a good tool to think about social welfare? And so we'll talk about that in our later video. But I also want to just say, let's think about this for a moment, right? Let's think about this for a moment, right? Before we get into like the nitty-gritty of, COVID vaccine pricing and sort of some theoretical and abstract thinking about if the government hadn't purchased COVID-19 vaccines, what would the pharmaceutical companies, if we lived in this hyper laissez-faire society where the government had no ability to intervene, or had no want or desire to intervene, what would they charge different people? Presumably, if they were a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, they could charge people that were elderly or people that had pre-existing conditions higher prices, right? Because they would presumably be further up the demand curve than younger people, right? If they were perfectly price discriminating monopolists. So I'm going to pause the video here, and then I'm going to continue with part 2 and talk about what are the limitations, what are the constraints that a monopolist has, and what are some of the constraints that a monopolist doesn't have that allows it to charge such a hefty markup, and then think about then think about more concretely the role of the government in sort of regulating or facilitating or impacting the price, so to speak, of the vaccine.